I'm Katy Gieder. I'm the biometrician for Vermont Fish and Wildlife, and I'm going to be starting off this presentation by summarizing the moose research that's been conducted specifically in Vermont, what the key findings have been. I'm going to place those findings in a context of how it informs our science-based management and what the plans are for the future for more research. As a biometrician, I lead and support our staff in science-based management for a wide range of species and their habitats. And by science-based management, I mean that verified, reviewed research and established scientific principles are used in all aspects of management, from data collection to analysis and decision-making. And that doesn't just apply to biological aspects of wildlife management. It's also vital to successful consideration and incorporation of environmental and social spheres. So this is why the department uses peer-reviewed, established principles and experts in its public surveys, as well as environmental and biological monitoring and management. It's also why this presentation starts out by emphasizing the collaborative work with other scientists and the huge amount and array of various research that forms crucial components of the moose management decision-making process. Science matters because without it, you simply do not have the vital information to make decisions on biological, environmental, and social aspects of wildlife species management. Scientific research provides vital information in science-based decision-making for all fish and wildlife species, including moose management. The focus for moose management at Vermont Fish and Wildlife has been on how winter ticks affect moose survival, reproduction, and health, and related moose habitat and genetics. Also, there has been research on tick control mechanisms, tick density, and distribution. A lot of information already exists from other studies in New Hampshire, Maine, Massachusetts, Minnesota, and other states out west, as well as Canadian provinces such as New Brunswick, Ontario, and Quebec, and more throughout the whole of moose range. Winter ticks are a major threat to moose health across a wide swath of moose range, and climate change is exacerbating those effects. But because climate change worsens this issue, it is also a fairly novel and evolving threat. So on the one hand, there is already a lot of research to draw from, but on the other, there are many ongoing questions. Hence the 4 studies within Vermont initiated in 2017 to 2018 that are outlined in dark green on this slide, on the time chart. These studies tackled a suite of winter tick moose-related health issues from moose survival, reproduction, health, habitat, and genetics to winter tick-specific control mechanisms. And because the winter tick threat is such a complex and ever-changing issue, despite the large volume already discovered, more questions remain and will be the focus of continuing research, specifically related to moose health, habitat, genetics, and winter ticks themselves. To summarize the research that has been conducted in Vermont thus far, for moose, first and most importantly, high moose density equals high tick infestations, winter tick infestations. Multiple research studies across many states and provinces have repeatedly found that where you have higher moose densities, you have severe tick infestations that cause large calf die-offs. The Vermont-specific studies highlighted in the previous slide found calf survival in Vermont is very low, as are pregnancy and birth rates, and calf nutrition condition, in other words, their health, is also very low. Concurrently, calf stress levels are extremely high. These findings all coincide with high winter tick loads in the northeastern part of Vermont, where moose densities are highest, and have furthermore been found during the peak blood-sucking period for winter ticks. They indicate that winter ticks are severely limiting calf survival and that female moose, or cows, are also unhealthy and not able to produce enough calves, and many of the few they do produce are unhealthy and unlikely to survive. Additionally, research in Vermont has found that specific habitat components, the specific makeup of the tree species or the age of trees in an area, affect calf survival in facing winter ticks, and fungi can actually kill winter ticks in a lab setting. While there's still much to be discovered about moose habitat and winter tick controls, for example, there are still many questions about how fungi might be able to kill winter ticks in a wild field setting. These initial findings on habitat and tick control are good starting points for strategizing habitat management or small-scale tick control options. But before we get ahead of ourselves, most importantly, the finding that high moose densities tied to high winter tick infestation levels cause really poor calf survival, pregnancy and birth rates, calf health, and high stress levels. That's really the key to this management recommendation that Nick will be describing in more detail later on. The habitat and fungi research are ongoing and will help identify and prioritize remaining research questions, and results will be shared in future presentations as they continue to surface. So to conclude, we know a lot, but we could know a lot more. This is a complex, ever-changing threat, so scientific research will continue and expand. We are now working with a regional network of other scientists in Vermont, Massachusetts, and New Hampshire, and potentially more states in the future, to fill information gaps that remain related to moose health and genetics, habitat connectivity, and winter tick density and distribution. As we continue to get new results, we will adapt management recommendations to those and communicate results and how they inform science-based management decisions for moose. I'll now pass it on to Nick, who will go through the specifics of the recommendation.
Hello everyone, I'm Nick Fortin, Deer and Moose Project Leader for the Vermont Fish and Wildlife Department. In this presentation, I'm going to cover the Department's 2021 Moose Harvest Recommendation and some of the science and reasoning that went into that recommendation. Moose population objectives in Vermont have been set in the Department's 2020 to 2030 Big Game Management Plan. In most of Vermont, those objectives are set at 0.5 moose per square mile. That's based primarily on the peak historical abundance of moose in those areas. The department will be looking at better refining our habitat mapping in those areas and trying to get a better sense of how many moose we really should expect to have in those areas. In northeastern Vermont, the population objectives have been set at 0.75 to 1 moose per square mile, and that is a reflection of the current research and science around the impact of winter ticks. We know that at lower moose densities, particularly when we get below 1 moose per square mile, winter tick impacts tend to be reduced. When we get above 1 per square mile, winter tick impacts tend to increase, and I'll talk a lot more about that later in this presentation. When we look at our current density estimates relative to those population objectives, what we see is that in most of Vermont, our current population is not only below the population objective, but also below what we consider our hunting threshold, which is about 75% of the population objective. So as long as populations remain below that hunting threshold, we will not be issuing moose hunting permits in those areas. However, in wildlife management units E1 and E2, the population is well above the objective, the upper objective of 1 moose per square mile. And so that is the area we're going to focus on for the rest of this presentation, and that is the area we're recommending to issue moose permits in 2021. And so if we look at this a different way, we can really see how different Wildlife Management Unit E is from the rest of Vermont. So in this map, each dot represents one estimated moose in the underlying Wildlife Management Unit. So you can clearly see there's a much higher density of moose up in Wildlife Management Unit E in the northeast corner of the state than there is anywhere else in Vermont. To put this in state it a different way, there are literally more moose in Wildlife Management Unit E than there are in the rest of Vermont combined. And so just to make this clear before we move on, the focus of the rest of this presentation and the focus of our 2021 moose harvest recommendation is on Wildlife Management Unit E in the northeast corner of the state, not the rest of Vermont. We are not recommending permits anywhere outside of Wildlife Management Unit E, and so the harvest recommendation isn't relevant to those areas, and the things I'll talk about in the rest of this presentation are not necessarily relevant to the rest of Vermont. There are different factors affecting moose in those areas than in Wildlife Management Unit E. Now, before we get into the 2021 moose harvest recommendation, I do want to quickly touch on last fall's moose harvest. So in 2020, we issued 55 moose hunting permits, again, all in Wildlife Management Unit E, and hunters ended up harvesting a total of 40 moose. What was most notable last season were the relatively high success rates. On top of that, 74% of hunters that returned a moose hunter survey reported that they passed up at least one moose. That included half of all unsuccessful hunters. Additionally, 88% of the moose that were harvested were bulls. That is the highest percentage of bulls ever harvested on either sex hunting permits. So that's quite remarkable and clearly suggests that hunters were being selective about the moose they harvested. Now, a summary of the 2020 moose harvest is available on the department's website for anyone that would like more information. Now, before we get into this year's recommendation, I think it's important to provide some perspective on why Wildlife Management Unit E is so different from the rest of Vermont. Now, WMUE is part of this larger moose core range that extends through northern New Hampshire and western and northern Maine. Now, this area has a colder climate than the rest of New England with longer winters. As a result of that, it has much lower deer densities than the rest of New England, and that reduces the incidence of brainworm, which causes problems for moose. But perhaps most importantly, this region is dominated by commercial timberland. So there's an abundance of active forest management, a lot of logging going on, and that creates a lot of young forest, early successional habitat, which provides a lot of food for moose. Now, moose are big animals and they need a lot of food, so that makes a big difference in how many moose the area can support, and that is the primary reason that that area supports much higher densities of moose than areas further to the south. It's also important to understand the historical abundance of moose in Wildlife Management Unit E in Vermont. So in the early 2000s, moose were very abundant in the Northeast Kingdom. They were causing a lot of damage to their habitat by overbrowsing, and their health was beginning to decline as a result of that. And so in the late 2000s, the department issued very high numbers of moose hunting permits in the Northeast Kingdom and intentionally reduced the moose population in order to both improve moose health and improve the health of their habitat and limit damage to the forest. That was quite successful. The population declined and permit numbers were greatly reduced beginning in 2011. Now, since that time, the population has remained relatively stable, so for about the past 10 years, despite very limited moose hunting. However, despite those improvements to the habitat by reduced overbrowsing, moose health measures have not improved. Adult female weights continue to be low. and reproductive rates are also low. Now, we do lack information on ovulation rate in recent years because we haven't been harvesting cow moose, but since 2017, we've had radio-collared cow moose in Wildlife Management Unit E, and we know from monitoring them that reproductive rates remain very low. So the question becomes, if we've reduced the moose density and the quality of the habitat has improved, why hasn't the population rebounded, and why haven't we seen improvements in moose health? And the answer is the winter tick. Now, winter tick is one of 14 species of tick found in Vermont. These are not deer ticks or dog ticks that people might come in contact with. They're different species of tick. They rarely bite humans and they don't transmit diseases to humans, but they can have a significant impact on moose. Also, unlike some of the other ticks that we're more familiar with, winter ticks are native to Vermont. They've been here for a long time. We documented them on moose back in the 80s. In fact, we documented them killing moose in the early 90s. So they are often called a moose tick because of the impact they can have on moose and because moose are their primary host. But what makes the winter tick really unique and a big reason why they can have such an impact on moose is their life cycle. Now, most species of tick are considered three-host ticks, which means they feed on a different individual host during each of the three phases of their life cycle. Winter ticks are relatively unique among ticks in that they are a one-host tick. That means they complete their entire life cycle, all three phases, on the same individual animal. Now, this graphic of the winter tick life cycle was borrowed from the Maine Department of Inland Fisheries and Wildlife. Of course, they're dealing with the same issue. But it's this life cycle of the winter tick that makes direct management of winter ticks difficult. They're rarely off the host. And it's also why they have such an impact on moose and not so much on other species. A winter tick is spending 6 months on the same individual animal. Any species that grooms itself regularly, like deer or pretty much anything other than moose, will remove most of those ticks before they're able to complete their life cycle. But moose are notoriously poor groomers, probably because they didn't evolve with external parasites like ticks. And so moose can support very high numbers, tens of thousands of winter ticks. As a result of that, the number of moose or the density of moose is the primary driver of the abundance or density of winter ticks. And that brings us back to this core moose range in New England. So this area, and really just the southern portion of this core range, is where winter ticks are having a major impact on the moose population. Outside of this area, despite a warmer and more favorable climate for ticks, there simply are not enough moose to support the high densities of ticks that would cause impacts. So it's really only in this core area where winter ticks are having a significant impact on moose. Of course, that's where most of the moose in New England are found. To understand why high moose densities result in high winter tick densities, let's consider this example. So keep in mind that questing larval winter ticks in the fall cannot actively seek a host. They're essentially immobile. They rely on a moose or another host to walk by and pick them up. So if there are more moose on the landscape, the likelihood of those questing tick larvae being picked up is much greater. So more larvae get picked up, and because there are more moose, they collectively pick up a greater number of larvae, and as a result, there are more total ticks that drop off in the spring to lay eggs and begin the cycle all over again. On the other hand, at lower moose densities, fewer of those questing larval ticks in the fall are going to be able to find a host, and the lower number of moose will collectively pick up fewer ticks, and therefore fewer ticks, adult ticks, will be dropped off in the spring. Now, in this scenario, we start with the same number of questing larvae in the fall, but if we were to play this out another year, there would be fewer questing larvae the following fall, and going forward, moose would pick up fewer ticks each year. Now, our overarching management goal for moose is to have a healthy moose population. We want to have big, fat, healthy cows that produce big, fat, healthy calves. We don't want skinny, sickly cows like this that either fail to produce a calf each year or produce underweight calves that struggle to survive. And most importantly, we don't want half of our calves to die every winter because of heavy winter tick loads. We understand it's counterintuitive to be killing moose to save moose, but the reality is having fewer, healthier moose will provide us with a more sustainable population that's more resilient to the many stresses that moose are going to face as our climate continues to warm. So if we consider what we know about moose survival rates and reproductive rates in Wildlife Management Unit E, based on now 4 years of monitoring radio-collared moose, and we go to project our population forward, we would expect it to remain relatively stable over the next 10 years and beyond. And that's consistent with what we've seen over the past 10 years with very minimal cow moose harvest. And if we were to harvest 10 cow moose each year, which is what we'd recommended and expected to be harvested in 2020, the population may decline over time, but it would decline very slowly, likely taking 2 decades or more to reach our population objective of 1 moose per square mile. In either of those scenarios, moose health will continue to be impacted by winter ticks for the foreseeable future, as long as moose density remains greater than 1 moose per square mile. And that would be inconsistent with our goal of managing for a healthy moose population. Now, this year, we're recommending the harvest of about 25 adult female moose. Now, that'll be sufficient to reduce the population to our objective of 1 moose per square mile within a reasonable time frame. Now, ideally, we might want to reduce the moose population quicker and improve moose health as quick as we can. But there are a lot of uncertainties when managing wild populations. We don't know exactly how many moose we're starting with. We don't know exactly what winter tick impacts are going to be each year. And so we don't want to overdo it right away. We want to give ourselves enough time to react to new information and to adjust our harvest each year as we get closer to that goal. So in order to achieve that desired harvest of about 25 adult female moose, we're recommending the issuance of 100 total moose hunting permits. The breakdown by season and wildlife management unit is shown here. What's important here is that 40 of those 100 permits will be for antlerless moose only. And we're recommending that in order to achieve that female moose harvest without putting too much pressure on the male segment of the population. For more information on moose management in Vermont and the department's 2021 moose harvest recommendation, visit vtfishandwildlife.com.